All right, so Pat Flynn, philosopher, writer, speaker, generalist, fitness chronicler, and kettlebell expert. Welcome to Reasonably Rational. So glad that you're joining us today.
Delighted to be here, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
So as a first time guest, as on a baby podcast too, maybe start with your autobiography, the story of Pat Flynn and how you became who you are today, and there's all kinds of interesting threads in there too. So I'll randomly pelt you with questions as we go. But yeah, introduce yourselves to the fine folks.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to give the concise version here. I always worry about boring people to death with autobiographical details, but you can pull at anything you want, Steve. I guess what's most relevant would be the philosophical and faith stuff. So I'll try to keep it focused on that. I was baptized Catholic actually, but I was brought up in a super nominalist household. We were sort of creasters early on, and then not even that, right? Or maybe we would like go to church when the grandparents were in town because impressions and whatnot. So I never had any proper religious catechesis teaching. I never really had any significant or even superficial religious types of conversations growing up. I didn't even have, and I was thinking about this somewhat recently, I didn't even really have many religious friends. It was very, very interesting, like just how secular. Grew up in the Midwest, a lot in Michigan and in Wisconsin, just how secular my upbringing was. So what really sort of pushed my initial trajectory towards a sort of atheistic or naturalistic outlook happened in around about the sixth grade. We always have these sort of, critical moments, if you will, and I can pinpoint this as one of them. And this will date me for better or worse, but when I was in the sixth grade is when 9/11 happened. And it was also when, being in science class, we started hearing about the sort of initial, in a very rudimentary way, origin stories of the universe. So this is kind of interesting because if you think about arguments against the existence of God, especially if you look to somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas, he really only considers two. And this itself is interesting because Aquinas is usually a guy who's like, here's 25 very good objections to the position I'm about to defend, right? And now let me refute that. But for God, like the biggest, like this is like so much hangs on this. He really, at least in his Summa, he just considers two, right? And I think he's pretty much right. There's only two that are, I mean, there's lots of objections, don't get me wrong, but there's two that are worth very deep thought, and one is the problem of evil, right? If God is how we suppose God to be, perfectly good, powerful, omniscient, and like, then why is there evil at all, let alone such a heavy distribution of intense evil, stuff like that, right? The second one he considers is something like this: perhaps the principles of nature are enough to explain everything that needs to be explained. Like maybe we just don't even need God in our worldview to account for anything, right? So in this sense, like that's not an argument against God. It's an argument for, don't posit something if you don't need it as an explanatory entity, right? Why do I bring that up? Well, that's without knowing it, I was sort of simultaneously hit with both of those objections in the sixth grade. 9/11, right. Big instance of evil, right? Like, oh man, this is horrible, and just kind of opened my somewhat sheltered eyes to a lot of the wickedness of the world. Of course, I had been exposed to wickedness before, but there's just something acute about that, right? So that's a problem, I thought. And then also like this origin story, I'm hearing about the universe being however many billion years old, 13.8 billion years old, and unfurling through this, very elaborate, chain of physical events. Like that doesn't seem to be the story I remember from like the first grade of there being a garden and some people with a snake, right? Like it's very crude at this point, right? Like you seem like different stories, right? And this one's supposed to be the smart one, so I think I'm going to prefer that, right? So again, I'm in the sixth grade, but this is like initial seeds of doubt, right? Then as I get a little bit older, and I was always sort of, racked, if you will, by philosophical questions. I think a lot of people are just kind of born philosophers. They don't really know it insofar as they're OCD, right? That's really what it is at the end of the day. So I remember like being very young and like looking out my grandparents' window and just wondering like, why is any of this here? Not like what brought it into existence. I was like threatened by the thought that it could just evaporate into nothingness and then say, like, what explains why it keeps going, right? So like deep in my soul was this like question of what philosophers call contingency. There's this stuff that exists, but there doesn't seem to be anything about its nature that demands that it exists, that it either came into existence or even stays in existence. So why doesn't all of everything just go blank, right? I was like, as a young kid, I was a little afraid to go to sleep at night because I didn't have a good answer to that. Like, maybe I'll go to sleep and it will all just evaporate, right? So that's...
So Pat, did you ever float those deep existential questions past like your playmates on the playground?
Oh,
the next
no,
day,
I knew they wouldn't. They would
kickball?
just think I was even weirder than I already was. So no, I mostly kept these things almost entirely to myself until I realized, like, oh, there's other weirdos out there that ask these types of questions. They actually think these questions are really important, perhaps the most important types of questions, and they're called philosophical questions. That's what they are, because what is philosophy? Well, philosophy is not just thinking hard and deep about things. Philosophy is just asking fundamental sorts of questions. You know, whenever you start getting deep, people are like, oh, dude, you're getting philosophical. Well, that's because that's what philosophy is. It's getting deep towards the most fundamental sorts of questions you can ask, right? Questions that go even deeper than where science can go. And we can talk about that later if we want. So I was always just had these sorts of questions rolling around my mind. I didn't know what they were. I didn't know that they were normal-ish, I guess. They're probably not that normal. But they are in a sense that I think like they're childlike, right? Kids are just naturally curious and have these big types of questions. So anyways, I start, getting more into philosophy, especially as I get into high school. And I'm very much influenced by certain thinkers who weren't necessarily philosophers. I was really big into Mark Twain. And he was, philosophically inspired, by a number of people. But he had an essay called What is Man? I remember reading that, and it's an essay really kind of promoting determinism. And that really fascinated me with respect to questions of human agency and moral responsibility and whether there's any conceptual space for libertarian free will and stuff like that. And so I was really into Twain and another guy named H.L. Mencken. Most people probably aren't familiar with him. He was like kind of I don't know, like the prototype of Christopher Hitchens is probably the best way to describe him, like an old, crusty, curmudgeon-y atheist, but an intellectual journalist. And so he was always, and I liked him for his prose style. He had a really, really amazing and interesting, perhaps to some people obnoxious prose style, but I really enjoyed his writing. And he had a number of interesting, like, theological writings. He was always critical, but, like, fairly, like, even looking back now, many years spent, in the kind of technical literature of these matters, like, okay, he wasn't a complete sophomore. Like, he was talking about, like the differences between like Molinism and Calvinism with respect to human freedom and stuff like that. A little bit crude, but for what he was doing, not as bad as like the contemporary new atheists, that's for sure. Anyways, he wrote the first English work on Friedrich Nietzsche. And so I picked that up, and that sort of pulled me into that whole school of, atheist existentialists, right? So let me condense this a little bit more because it could probably get a little bit boring. So that colors my worldview, my outlook for many years. Throughout college, I would have, as I'm trying to go deeper into philosophy and answer, as many questions as I can that seem important. I would have considered myself a naturalist, and a naturalist is just somebody who thinks they hold a philosophically developed form of atheism. So atheism traditionally is the position that there is no God or anything like God. But that doesn't tell you much about the world. It just tells you that there's at least one thing not in it, right? Whereas naturalism is a project that tries to take atheism, as part of it, but then give some sort of explanation of all the sorts of things that need to be explained by a worldview, right? And there's different flavors and forms of naturalism. But that's what I was inclined to until I just realized I just couldn't answer pretty much anything that I wanted a good account for, including some of the things we already talked about: contingency, human agency, freedom, the moral dimension, moral realism. At pretty much every point, it either left these matters entirely brute, saying there just is no answer to them, or it gave it such a contrived explanation it was not even plausible at all to my mind, or it tried to eliminate the data. Insofar as an example of this would be, a good example would be morality, right? Most of us think that morality is like our moral judgments are qualitatively different than our judgments about flavors of ice cream, right? Like, if you get what I'm saying, like, it's not just a subjective matter. Like, no, we think
Right.
that, like, murder is wrong, and that isn't just how I feel about murder. It's wrong, full stop, for everybody. It's attitude independent, right? That's how most of us in our everyday common sense mode, how we speak, talk, especially how we talk politically, that's sort of how we assume morality is. It's this sort of objective feature of the world. And I think look, and there are naturalists who try to develop a form of moral realism, but I think the sort of best natural fit for naturalism is to be what's called a moral anti-realist, and to tell some story about why morality isn't what we think it is, right? That it is really a set of false but useful beliefs programmed into us by these evolutionary forces that are useful for what? For avoiding bears and procreating, something like that. So we're really under like a very powerful evolutionary delusion, right? So that doesn't that's kind of an explanation, but not really, right? Like, if the explanation is moral realism, you're not explaining that, right? You're explaining that away and replacing it with something different. And I thought that like maybe like if naturalism could explain everything else super well, and that was the one cost I had to bear, fair enough. But that's just one of many examples where
And Pat, were you, so at this point you're kind of what, in college or after college, as the whole kind of naturalist position starts to run out of gas?
Through and out of undergrad for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
And are you kind of realizing you've come to the chasm with no bridge across it on your own? Just sort of you're starting to get the sense, I think this this whole atheist naturalist worldview has taken me about as far as it can go, and there's just gaps I can't live with? Or had you already begun to encounter counter arguments to it?
Yeah.
Theistic arguments, or something that specifically targeted your position and undermined it?
Yeah, the answer is no. Like, I was totally not hip to natural theology arguments for the existence of God. This is really just sort of an internal problem, if you will. Like, it's just natural. And let me motivate this a little bit more, is that, like, I think we all kind of hold these core basic commitments. Some people might just call them Morian facts, right? They're so obvious you can't really shake them. At least, I mean, you can say you don't hold them, but it's really hard to truly believe that you don't, right? Morality is a good example, but here are some others. That I exist, that there is an enduring conscious subject, right? And that I am the same person, the same substance, primary substance that I was when I was 3 years old, 1 month old, right? There's an enduring... naturalism has a very hard time making sense of that, right? We can explain why, but it just does. So, and same thing, determinism, right? If you're a naturalist, you're sort of a reductionist, a microphysical reductionist. You think that everything about the world sort of reduces to, atomic and evolutionary theory. But that extends, of course, up through us and all of our beliefs, thoughts, and actions, right? So it doesn't seem like there's any room for genuine, not just human agency, but we'd also need that more conceptual space to even make sense of human rationality. So, like, those are two other things that seem like they really don't fit within what we may say the inner logic of naturalism. Now, what could you do at this point? Well, what you could do is you could try to, like, tweak the logic of naturalism. So you can try and fit these things in. But then at that point, I think you lose what is the primary motivation for naturalism. What is it? That we can just science everything, right? And if we, so the whole idea of, like, why you should be a naturalist in the first place is that we can explain everything that needs to be explained through, like, some ideal completed science, namely physics, right? So, okay, but that's telling us a story that is totally incompatible with these basic features of reality. That's like forcing me to eliminate these features of reality or identify them with something that they were clearly not, right? And we haven't even gotten into consciousness and qualitative experience and reductionist theories of philosophy of mind. Those are, so, like, there's a big suite of issues here, right, for me. And then it's just like, well, okay, if I'm going to, like, mess with the worldview in such a way that I essentially give up the scientism that motivates it. Scientism is an epistemology, a theory of knowledge, right? Of how we know the things we know, namely through this hypothetico-deductive scientific method, and that sort of constrains our ontology of what we think actually exists, right? But to make sense of all these things, I'm saying that I'm getting rid of that. Well, if you get rid of that, I'm like, what's the point of being a naturalist in the first place, right? Like, if I'm just going to contrive my theory to fit these things in, I've just given up what seems to be the primary motivation to subscribe to. we're gonna science it all, brother. And look, this is not. I always have to qualify. This is not a rejection or even degradation of science. In fact, I think science itself, and the best of what science is telling us, is itself incompatible with naturalism. I think so much of what science shows us about the world is a very dappled picture where you have many different forms of causation. Forms of holism and top-down causation. Like, I think naturalists have a very poor understanding of what the best of science is even showing us. Setting that aside, that's where I was at, Steve, right? Is okay, I've got all these things that seem like as real as anything. Like, man, if I were to deny these, I wouldn't even have conceptual space to think or reason or anything. Mm-hmm. And they seem deeply inconsistent with the inner logic of naturalism, and many professional naturalists do actively deny them. This isn't just some like caricatured position. There's many nihilists out there, moral anti-realists, eliminativists. I'm not going to say they're the mainstream positions, but they're out there, a lot of smart. And I think that those people are trying to think consistently within the inner logic of naturalism. I think the other people who don't take those positions have contrived or sort of seriously undercut the motivations for naturalism in the first place. So that's where I was at. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know what's true at this point, but I know that whatever this is, it's not it. That's where it was. So there weren't any arguments for God on the table or anything like that. It was just realizing, I just don't think this, I don't think this is right. I don't think this is right.
Pat, were you studying philosophy as an undergrad? Was that your major, or was this kind of like an intellectual side hustle while you were studying something else?
So I have 2 masters in philosophy, but my undergrad is actually in economics and finance. And I was doing actually a couple different things. I wanted to do either music or philosophy originally. Music, I was heavily discouraged from getting a degree in music. I've got a lot of finance people in my family, right? So like, what? Get a real degree, right?
Right.
And then the philosophy courses at my undergrad, I guess there's no reason to be polite. They were awful, right? They were really kind of like the worst cartoon version of political indoctrination facilities that you can imagine, like straight up. And like, this is like, I knew that at the time when I was like a pretty liberal guy, right? Like, whatever this is, I don't want any part of it. So I kept studying philosophy. I had already been studying philosophy just personally very seriously. So I kept doing that just, on my own throughout my undergrad, and still took philosophy courses, even though the undergrad ones were thoroughly abysmal. And then after undergrad, then I went and pursued philosophy specifically at graduate, and I'm probably about like a year and a half from finishing the PhD at this point.
Nice.
For people that, yeah.
Excellent.
So sorry, now I lost the thread of where we. Oh yeah, you asked me if I had known any arguments for God or no, and very interesting. Like I had never even encountered, because there was like a philosophy group, I guess, or whatever at undergrad, and we argued, about many different things, but I don't think any of them were like theists or so. There's no like theistic representative that I have, like serious one that I had really encountered, at least during those years. However, I did have some exposure to people who believed in God in a sense, and after I sort of threw my hands up with naturalism, I realized I should go like back and like consider different paradigms and different schools of thought. And I had your kind of basic undergrad familiarity with your Aristotle and Plato and those guys, and so I wanted to start like taking another look and taking these different paradigms seriously. And to just fast forward the story significantly, I found them at first just like very intriguing and kind of weird. And then the more I looked at them, I realized, well, maybe they're not so weird. Maybe there's actually something plausible here. And then the more I looked at them, the realized was, oh, they're not just plausible. These guys are correct, right? And really what pushed me totally over was not just eventually getting to the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, but Thomists in general, those who follow the footsteps of St. Thomas Aquinas. And I often tell people, because it's true, that I was really a Thomist and a classical theist even before I was Catholic. And the way I see St. Thomas is he's not like the first great medieval philosopher. He's like the last great classical philosopher. He is a sort of the acme of big tent Platonism, right? Who synthesizes the best of the Aristotelian, the best of the Neoplatonic schools of thought, and gives you this incredibly beautiful worldview that's deeply systematic, that connects his work in metaphysics with philosophical anthropology, the moral dimension. I mean, the coherence alone, the systematicity of it was just extremely striking, extremely beautiful. And that was where I finally found that philosophers could argue about God and argue for the existence of God through natural theology. And that like sucked me right in, right? I mean, like this is like, oh man, this is like reason can do this. Like, you know, people like Aristotle and Plato and Plotinus and Augustine, like they really thought that you could just start with the basic aspects of experience, deduce various causal and explanatory principles, and run them through to some ultimate source of intelligibility, and then deduce the characteristics, at least broadly, of what that ultimate source is, and come out with this sort of classically theistic picture. So that was where I ended up eventually kind of specializing my thought. I mean, my PhD research right now is on the doctrine of divine simplicity as an extremely fruitful theoretical paradigm for solving a host of issues in metaphysics, meta-epistemology, meta-ethics, and stuff like that.
You went for the low-hanging fruit, Pat. Divine simplicity. Nothing easier than that.
Yeah, well, it's, you know, to me, as coming at it from a philosophical perspective, you know, most people probably aren't totally familiar with this commitment, but to me, it's beautiful, and it has to be correct if God exists. But it's extremely controversial, right? Among at least a lot of contemporary Christians. It wasn't back then. Like classical theism with divine simplicity, the commitment that God has no real distinctions that amount to real ontological composition. God doesn't have any parts. He's not built up from components that are more basic than himself. And the basic logic there is that anything that is composite is in some sense, you know, dependent upon or derives its existence or character or both from those more fundamental components. Well, if God is truly ontologically supreme and fundamental, he cannot depend on or derive from anything more basic than himself, including internal components, right? That's the basic summary of what motivated so many, both Christian and non-Christian thinkers, Islamic, Jewish, pagan, to the commitment that whatever else God is, he is absolutely ontologically simple, right? Otherwise, you do not have a truly, you don't have the right sort of theoretical entity that could actually be necessary in itself, ontologically independent, and the source of everything else, right? So like people think simplicity is this old like medieval thing. It's not. It's not at all. It's not. It really is the sort of metaphysical glue that holds everything together. And what I wanted to focus on in my PhD research is not only summarizing a lot of the really great defenses that have gone on in the technical literature around divine simplicity. It's been very ably defended in recent years from attacks that were long seen as like devastating. But then to like remind people of how explanatorily awesome this doctrine is, and then explore a lot of newer areas that I don't think have been explored. We can get into that later if we want, but yeah. So like coming at this philosophically, like this was always extremely important to me, and then sometimes Catholics are a little bit surprised to know that divine simplicity is a dogma for us, right? Now there's a little bit of like gray area of whether you have to affirm the strict Thomistic understanding of it or whatever. But no, this is a dogma of the Catholic Church. And yes, it is in a very complicated way that I think St. Thomas ably expands is compatible with the doctrine of the Trinity. Something we can get into if you want to spend another 4 hours working through that.
Yes, please.
Just want to flag that, like, it didn't escape people that you're saying that God is a Trinity and absolutely simple, right? Like, it doesn't escape people that that's something you should think about, right? They thought about it very long and hard and came up with some very clever, I think, ultimately good answers to that. So that was extremely attractive to me, motivating for me, from the perspective of trying to find a worldview that could explain all the things that I think needed to be explained. And if you have a classical theistic worldview, then what you have is a worldview where there's one absolutely fundamental reality that's ontologically simple, whose essence is identical to his existence, is identical to the good as such, right? Classical theists are committed to a thesis that goodness and being are actually convertible. So like the form of the good just is God, to use Platonic language. So goodness and existence are primitive, and those provide the basis for, I think, a really kind of beautiful creation story of why God would bring things into creation, a realm of finite contingent beings that not only come from God, but are ordered back towards God, their ultimate fulfillment, to return to the Alpha and the Omega. And this is kind of, and I detailed this in my book a little bit. This is kind of beautiful and intriguing, because to kind of really have deep union with God, which is what God is ultimately aiming creation towards, kind of hard to do that if you're a rock. You kind of need to be a conscious being to have, friendships, love, and communion. And what I found so beautiful about the Christian tradition, this doesn't get talked about as much, I try to bring it back out in my book, is that this actually kind of motivates a sort of story about why God made us. Because when you think about us from a philosophical perspective, what we are is we're sort of the acme of creation, where in the human being, we're kind of that concentration point between the higher spiritual realms, the angels with their rational intellect and will, yet we're also material beings, right? So like all creation kind of, bam, is concentrated in us, such that when God pulls us into union with himself, he's, metaphysically dragging all of creation along for the ride. I found that story so beautiful, so beautiful.
Yeah.
Like whatever, like that is good. That is good stuff, right? Because you not only have an entity that's capable of producing a world like this, but now you have some good reason to think that it might very well do so, right? Mm-hmm. And to have beings like us that are ordered towards the good itself, so they need to have certain natures that sort of determine certain real goods for them to be integrated around goodness. So this provides a sort of really nice essentialist basis for morality that ties to a really great sort of meta-ethic of axiarchism tied to classical theism. We're material beings, so we require all sorts of material conditions, a physical universe to be and get around. God, of course, is capable of bringing that about, an orderly, stable universe with replete with teleology and directedness, right? So like this story is like giving us everything that we want. And of course, as classical theists, we're not total reductionists. So, like what's primary isn't necessarily the microphysical base, it's substances. And by substances, I don't mean like as chemists use it, I mean as philosophers use it. I'm a substance, a tightly unified being. That's what a substance is. So I have, top-down causal powers that can affect the course of history. It isn't just the course of history that affects me, right? I have powers of rational willing specifically, right? And that itself can work in a top-down way to not just, determine my physical actions, or I can will to raise my hand, right? But also the environments around me. So there's conceptual space for freedom of the will. There's a great story to tell about morality, about order, stability, contingency. Why is the universe contingent? Well, it was freely willed by God. So a necessary being through an act of, an analogous act of free will brings about something that did not have to exist, right? So that's a really great result. We can explain why we have this basic, obvious intuition that things are contingent, because they are. They didn't have to be. They were gratuitously created. But now we also have a good story of why it's not going to go into nothingness, because God is a rational being. If he's going to create things, he's going to see his project, if you will, through to the end. And Aquinas talks about this, that it would be contrary to God's nature, right, to just like suddenly abandon you. So we can go to bed at night, perfectly cool and collected, right? That things aren't going to blip out into nothingness. So we have contingency, but we also have stability, like good reason to affirm that things are going to keep moving along, right? So
all those years later, you
finally
can go to sleep.
I can like get rid of the melatonin, right? So that's great news. But and there's lots of details here, Steve. But you can see like here's a worldview that can tell at least a very plausible story about all these things that I think we should be able to tell a good story about. It doesn't force you to eliminate them, and it can integrate them. And at root, the theory is really simple, because when it comes to simplicity as a virtue of theory selection, what matters is kind of what happens at the fundamental level, right? Not how many things you're committed to overall, but like what's going on at the fundamental level. How simple is that, and how unifying is it? And classical theists have, I think, the best deal that there is, right? One absolutely simple, ontologically simple entity from which everything else flows. So sorry, I just went off for a long time. Why don't I
No,
pause?
that's lovely. Were there, you said that you came to the Thomistic worldview initially by way of Thomists, by disciples of Aquinas,
Yeah.
which eventually gets you to Aquinas himself, to the Summa, etc. Who were a couple of the Thomists that you found and found influential and persuasive, who kind of began to open up for you this completely different narrative from the one that you had been working on all those years?
Yeah, so many. Let me give some of my favorites. So Norris Clark, brilliant metaphysician, and in his book One and the Many was where I was first exposed to this sort of grand creation narrative from a philosopher, and I was like, this is beautiful. This is amazing. I need to pour myself into understanding this better. So he was huge. He also really just brilliantly motivated the general metaphysical system and understanding, like, look, the reason that Aquinas and Aristotle and all those guys were committed to these seemingly spooky, metaphysical entities like essence and existence and form and matter, substance, attribute, is because they're necessary to explain a lot of these basic features of experience. Sorry, there's a train that runs right behind my house. It's like literally 100 yards away, so it always comes when I podcast. But right, so like you posit these different sort of explanatory principles, because without them you can't make sense of unity and diversity or change at all, right? For something to change, something must stay the same. So that's where you have substance and attribute, right? What's called a constituent ontology. So that was really like intellectually very interesting and satisfying me, because it helped solve a lot of just kind of philosophical puzzles that I had for a long time, like related to those types of questions. So like that was sweet. In epistemology, Bernard Lonergan, Yves Simon are two people that I think are just absolutely brilliant and should be read. Technical, difficult, but highly rewarding. Gavin Kerr, good friend of mine. He's done a lot of work on Aquinas' natural theology. I've really benefited from his treatment of Aquinas' different ways to God and 5 ways, so I highly recommend him. Jacques Maritain was really helpful and interesting to me when it comes to understanding not just God's providence, but God's universal creation and human freedom and the possibility of sin, stuff like that. And then another guy who I think extends that project to a really satisfying point, contemporary, another friend of mine, W. Matthews Grant. He's got a wonderful book called Free Will and God's Universal Causality. So if you're just, kind of like those questions are, bumping around in your head, definitely grab that book. It was it's magnificent. I know I'm forgetting a million. I'll remember them afterwards, but those are just, there's a bit of a start there,
that's
at least. Yeah.
That's a good starting lineup right there.
Mm-hmm. And these guys they're all different, and they're all like doing different projects, and it was very cool to see how the basic principles and resources of Thomas were being so richly deployed in so many different areas, right? Epistemology, metaphysics, ethics. David Oderberg, he's another Thomist, right? He does a lot of work in ethics, and he's got a wonderful book called The Metaphysics of Good and Evil. So he'd be another one that was very influential upon me as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Beautiful. So, and then in the middle of all this drama too, I mean, you've got kind of your intellectual journey that begins to sync up and maybe undergird and even catalyze the faith journey on the personal level. At some point in here, there's a lovely woman that comes into your life and becomes your wife, and there's a family. Give us a little bit of that side of the story too.
Yeah. So that's mixed in all that. Extremely lovely woman, my wife Christine. She came in when I was still an atheist, and she has a book out through Catholic Answers called Religious, Not Just Spiritual, I think it is, and she kind of details her own conversion account, because she was brought up in a very kind of new agey household, and when she met me, I made her into an atheist, right? Because I tried to disabuse her of all that nonsense, right? And then, she complained that I made her so nihilistic and so depressed because of that worldview. And so we both converted, obviously, but they were very different paths. We had kids, and hers was just a deep experiential love for our first child. Like, she just wholesale rejected whatever atheism I put in her head, like as soon as she held our baby for the first time, right? She's like, this is just incompatible with that. this stays, that goes. Like, boom. And I think, you know what? I think that's perfectly rational, right? You need an epistemological story to justify that, but I think it can easily be told. So I don't think that's irrational at all, actually. So, right. And then, I start to shift my positions, and at some point I start beginning to take the Christianity very seriously, because even as I was considering and even becoming a theist, in I guess like typical American fashion, like, well, let's just look east. And I was very interested in like religious pluralism. I did have one of my best friends is Hindu. So I spent a lot of time in those schools of thought. The idea that in a hopefully not naive way, that all religions are groping at something transcendent, but they're all failing in a sense, right? That was initially attractive to me, but the more I spent with Thomas, the more I was just getting super heavy heapings of theology, right? Of specifically Catholic theology. And sort of the same thing that happened with theism was happening to me with that, where I'm like, first like, okay, this is interesting, a little exotic, don't really understand it, but interesting. And certainly it's connecting with these philosophical commitments I'm holding. And read it more, I'm like, hey, it's pretty, actually kind of plausible. And then eventually, oh no, these guys are correct, right? And of course, like mixed into there was a historical investigation, and everybody kind of does that because Christianity is a historical resurrection that makes very critical claims about definitive miraculous things, namely the resurrection that happened to history. And is there at least a decently credible historical basis for that? The short answer is I believe that there was, reading the scholarship on that, which is pretty robust. At least it's credible enough that if you already have the theistic background and story, that like it's really befitting. Like, oh, this actually makes a lot of sense given the nature of God, like the incarnation and atonement. And like it's just sort of thing that you would expect, that God, to bring creation back to himself, would first enter into creation to achieve the sort of, to help facilitate that unity, right? That's already in my kind of background. Like this just really fits really nicely, right? So again, details that I'm omitting, but I remember at one point I'm walking around the track at the YMCA with Christine, and I'm like, kind of like super embarrassed and nervous to like bring this subject up to her, because like I know I had like like seriously disparaged any of her spirituality before. I was not the best like person when I was younger, way too arrogant, all this. So like now I feel like I have egg on my face, right? And I also know that she's got a pretty deep bias against Christianity, and for whatever reason, in particular Catholicism. She grew up in the South. She did not have great experiences because she was not religious, right? She was raised in kind of a New Agey household among the religious people down there, so she had she didn't want anything to do with it. So I'm like thinking, I really want to consider this. I'm feeling drawn to it. Of course, I am being drawn to it. Yeah, I didn't totally appreciate it at the time by the Holy Spirit. And I somehow, try to angle in to the suggestion that, hey, I've been thinking about Christianity, and maybe there's more to it than I originally thought. And, she was not happy about this at first. And then, we walked maybe for like an hour, like arguing, as couples do, just arguing about it. Pretty funny stuff. And then at the end of it, my wife she's very funny, so wonderful, and she will argue and she will hear you out even if she doesn't want to at first, at least me anyways. At the end of it, she's like, all right, I will think about Christianity with you, but no way in hell am I ever becoming Catholic, right? That was what left it at that. So long story short, I mean, she's deeply, totally Catholic now, right? She was baptized and confirmed and all that stuff. So there's
famous last words.
There's an interim there, right, of things that happen. And like at the point I was like, well, shoot, because that's really the only form of Christianity I think is even kind of plausible, right? But I was like, progress is progress, I guess. So I'm not going to push it any further. So over time, like I kind of start sneaking off to Catholic-y things. I start sitting in it at Mass, and I had a few experiences that I feel were very profound spiritual experiences, including at Mass. that just totally, because you have these intellectual conversions, but you need the moral conversion, the conversion of the heart. So I absolutely went through that.
Any of those, Pat, that you can share as a compliment to the, as I mean, obviously I love the, for me, the way I'm wired, it's like what I without going into my whole backstory, but I tell people I'm Catholic because I tried not to be. I tried to read my way out of the church and ended up boomeranging myself right back in it with a new appreciation for it I had. So the intellectual door in has always been just super appealing to me. I get that at a fundamental, but the experiential piece too, the way that just the grace of those things sometimes
totally
complements and reaffirms the intellectual piece is always fascinating to me. If there's a couple of those that you don't mind,
sure.
I'd love
sorry,
to
I don't
hear
mean to suppress the account. I always, again, I understand that sometimes hearing these stories can, for a lot of people, be a lot more important and moving than like, here's a, 27-step syllogism or something like that, right? So yeah, here's the big one, right? So like how I can remember like that hinge point in the 6th grade. This was absolutely the one for me. It was Christmas Eve, and we're at some point where my wife is considering Christianity. She's still pretty staunchly, anti-Catholic. I'm like, man, I need to find a way to bring my whole family into the church type of thing. So it's Christmas Eve. She's preparing she's an amazing cook. She's putting on this beautiful dinner. It's stormy it's crazy outside, right? Like a blizzard type of deal. We're in Pennsylvania, a little outside of Philly at this point, and I just feel this deep pull that I need to go to Mass. I just need to go to Mass. So I get on stairs, I tell Christina, I'm like, I got to go to Mass. And she's like, what? No, I just made this whole dinner. You're not going to, what are you doing? I said, I just need to do it. I just need to do it. So I got in the car and drove out there and got to Mass. And yeah, at the consecration, and I'm not really like a big feelings guy. I've always been more in the head. It was just one of those things where just on the most deep existential level, like this, I knew I was there, right? I knew I was home. Like this was it for me. And I like whatever that movement was, it was so qualitatively confirming to me, if that makes. I had never really experienced anything like that before, so that was clearly a direct, like, not even just nudge from the Holy Spirit, but like shove, right? And I so that was that for me. That was the biggest one. And then eventually, the thing for Christine, she's said this in many interviews and time before, the biggest thing that eventually got her to give Catholicism a chance and start coming and sitting in at Mass with me were none of the arguments. She didn't care about my arguments. She She noticed that I was becoming a much better husband and father.
Wow.
Yeah. So she can, if you ever talk to her, she can give the details about that, but that was it. And she said that is something that she couldn't explain or ignore. And so, fast forward again a little bit, she eventually decides to just sit in at Mass with me, and at the Eucharist has her own profound experience, like almost mirroring mine. And at that point, she just dropped whatever resistance she had left, and she came fully into the church, got baptized. We got our marriage blessed in the church. We had 3 kids at the time. They all got baptized, and then been on that path ever since. So
yeah, wow, praise God. That's the beauty to the complementarity. And the other podcast, Life I Live, with my wife Becky, the co-host. We had the privilege of having Christine on and chatting with her about her book, and then we had you on as well shortly thereafter. But it was neat to hear the account from your side and from hers, because of course the account is very much the same, and yet profoundly different in a way that you would suspect would be pretty natural, given that God brought you where He wanted you by way of the gifts He's given you, the passions, the interests, the intellect, and brought her in that same way. And so just the complementarity of that whole story is just kind of a lovely thing. And that's true of, I'm sure many other couples who have found their way into the church together, or even in a staggered fashion, like, I don't know what, Scott and Kimberly Hahn or someone, but there's a phrase that a good friend of mine, Dr. Ryan Hanning, uses that I've appreciate, and I steal it from him while still citing him when I do so, but he calls it a conspiracy of grace.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
Which is just such a lovely way to describe it. The movement that brings you to where you are called to be, and you look back, and the twists, the turns, the ups and downs, the chart. Of course, you could never have charted, but it's just in the hands of providence. It's a conspiracy of grace. So yeah, that's beautiful, Pat. I love that.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I have to remember to reflect upon and share some of those more, because they were, like, I focus on the philosophy stuff because that's what interests me. That's what I think about the most. But this was not just some pure, like, Spock intellectual thing, right? I mean, I'm a human person, and I had things that I deeply cared about and experiences that were hugely significant and moving as well. I'll tell one more very, very quickly. So two of the most important people in my life were my grandparents on my mom's side. They were devout Catholics, the most beautiful, wonderful, holy people, meant the world to me, right? So as I'm considering Christianity, they both pass away, and I'm starting to, like, try to relinquish a lot of my materialist, not like my dual materialist philosophies, like not just like the previous naturalism I held, but like I was like super consumerist and like into like having things and whatever. So, it was told to me that in my grandfather's will, I was to, receive his Rolex, really nice Rolex, right? And like, a few years ago, that would have like really excited me. But like, even then I was like, okay, that's cool. That's great. Nice watch. Not really a watch guy, but whatever. So, we go and to their house and to, help clean things up and pick up the last things and, get some of the things that were left to us. Turns out the Rolex is completely gone. It's gone. Nobody knows where it went. Not attributing maliciousness to anybody. I don't think anyone in our family would have stole it or whatever. It's just gone. It's just gone, right? Totally gone. And the only thing left in their house, literally the only thing aside from like the frames of the bed, is this china plate of the Virgin Mary in the room that I used to stay in. Because my parents separated when I was very young, so I stayed with my grandparents. In the very room over the bed that I used to stay in is the only thing. And like, it was very clear to me, right? That was what I was supposed to have because that was where I was supposed to go, right? Like, I mean, it's just providence, just slapping you across the face type of stuff, right? Like, forget the watch, knucklehead, right? This, right? And it's the Virgin Mary, Catholic could it be, right? And just showing like, no, like God has been in control this whole time, right? Through all the people in my life. And so like things like that, right? Is it a miracle in a technical sense? No, but it's obvious divine winking, right?
Yep.
So stuff like that, yeah.
So, Pat, you're also a generalist, and this is when I've actually. So I was aware of you. I had come across your podcast, wonderful podcast, Philosophy for the People, which I very much enjoy. And so I had my intellectual onboarding of podcasts consists largely of whatever YouTube podcast I stick on when I'm at the gym in the morning. That's kind of my quiet time to myself sort of thing. And so I'm on a treadmill or doing whatever, and I'll just be listening to podcasts. So I had come across Philosophy of the People, really enjoyed it. But one of the things that was interesting to me was, I don't remember who you were talking to, but you got on kind of the topic of being a generalist, which you've actually written a book about. And I should also have mentioned, my fault because I'm doing a fine job of hosting here. The book that you were referring to earlier, The Best Argument for God, is out from Sophia Institute Press. Really great book. I very much enjoyed that. So to our listeners here, make sure you check out Pat's The Best Argument for God from Sophia Institute Press. But the generalist thing was fascinating to me. You and your guest were just kind of talking through that. And what I found so interesting about it was, for you, it wasn't just a matter of I'm interested in a bunch of stuff, so I kind of, just sort of like anyone does, I guess I pursue what I'm interested in. Therefore, I play guitar, and I'm a fitness guy, and I'm a philosopher, et cetera, et cetera. But you had a much more sort of substantial and fundamental philosophical view of the value of being a generalist. I maybe walk that out a bit, because I really did. For me, I hadn't heard. I'd heard the term, had a sense of what it was, but I hadn't heard somebody talk about it as sort of like there's a value proposition here to thinking about life and its passions, interests, skill building in this kind of way that I just found was very interesting and unique.
Yeah. Okay. So a few things to say, and they will involve rewinding the tape a little bit so I can answer your question. So that the book you mentioned on generalism is the humbly called How to Be Better at Almost Everything. That's right. I clearly love to have humble titles for my books. The best argument for God. Publishers like that sort of thing, right? And that was like written, it was published after I converted, but it was written because, publishing takes a long time, as I was converting. And if you read the book, you can tell it's kind of like two people, because I kind of converted in the middle of it. It's a bit disjointed. So I think the content is still, very good, but like I wish I could rewrite it all in a consistent tone, because I start like talking about virtue ethics and Aquinas in the book a little bit. So like, you can tell like Pat's kind of moving somewhere here. Is I think if you know my psychology at the time, that the tone of that book might be a bit more interesting to you. All right, so why did I write that book? Well, it started in a kind of funny way. So for people who don't know, what I do to pay my bills is not the philosophy stuff. Philosophy all it does is just suck your money right down the drain. I live a very weird life. So when I was an undergrad, I was on the Taekwondo team, so I've been a martial artist for most of my life, and I was on the Taekwondo team. I was competing in that, and I was very much into strength training and trying to perform better. And my coach at the time, who later became one of my best friends, who's that Hindu I talked about, introduced me to kettlebells. If you've ever seen kettlebells, they're like a cannonball with a handle on it. And I fell in love with them as a training modality because of their efficiency, and I thought just general usefulness for the types of things I was looking to develop as a martial artist. And went and got certified through the Russian Kettlebell Challenge under Pavel Tsatsouline, who's a pretty well-known name in fitness circles. I was the youngest person to ever do it at the time, actually, like 19 or something like that. And around that time, I started just like, YouTube's pretty new. I'm like, oh, there's this thing where I can like share workout ideas. And I had a blog, and I always blogged about everything, like I still do now. But nobody cared about the philosophy stuff back then. But they did care about the fitness stuff. And I started building without, kind of knowing at all what I was doing, various fitness platforms that got pretty popular enough that by the time I was not even finished with my undergrad, I had a book deal with Wiley to write a For Dummies book on fitness. So long story short, I decide that I think I can do that for a living, and so I start trying to study and understand business and marketing as much as I possibly could. I joined business masterminds. I had mentors, learned all about the world of direct response marketing and internet marketing and platform building and just all that good stuff. So I that's what I do for a living. I have an online fitness business. All right. So how does that connect with the generalism book? Well, at some point, somebody emailed me, like kind of asking for business advice because they wanted to get in the fitness industry, and it was kind of funny because it was a little bit insulting. They're like, Pat, like you seem to have done very well in the fitness industry, but like you're not like a bodybuilder, and like you don't have any world records at deadlifting, so like what's like how do you stand out? And like I wasn't, so like no surprise, like I think I'm in very good shape, but I'm not a hardcore specialist or world champion in any of that stuff, and I've never even wanted to be. And this caused me to reflect, well, I think what I have is a certain stack of skills that a lot of other people don't, right? So in the fitness industry, like, I'm a thinker. I have backgrounds in philosophy. I've been a writer for a long time. I think I have some very good writing chops. I took the time to understand and study business. I'm a pretty decent communicator, did a lot of speech and debate in high school. So I'm pretty good on camera, pretty good on a podcast. And yeah, I'm in good shape, and I've got good technique, and I can communicate this well. And what I thought was, okay, yeah, I'm not bigger, faster, stronger than everybody else out there. That's a losing game because you're just never going to be that person. But I have a stack of skills that it's that skill stack of being a generalist, being good to great, or at least fairly competent at lots of different things. That allowed me to stand out in a noisy industry and form a competitive advantage without having to be the best at any one thing. And then, like, you know, I started thinking about that. I'm like, I think there's kind of an idea there. Like, maybe I could try to develop that a little bit. And, you know, over a couple years, that's exactly what I tried to do. I tried to think about reverse engineer, because I wasn't like super conscious about all this stuff. Reverse engineer, you know, how I went about trying to acquire different skills or integrate different skills and stack different skills to form those competitive advantages. You know, disciplines to learning and skill acquisition, and how to choose what skills and how to combine them. And there's a business focus to the book for sure, but I think it obviously expands far beyond business. And so that became that book. That became, you know, how to be better at almost everything. And sorry, I don't know if I answered your question, because I forget what your I
think it was even probably less a question and just an observation on my end that I found fascinating. Kind of your philosophical reasons for being a generalist. The skill stacking was part of it. There's, like you said, certainly this is a way to pay the bills and to stand out in a marketplace that's crowded and noisy by, you know, kind of being my own unique combinatorial self of these different skills and abilities that I've worked to develop. But what I think kind of, and I don't remember exactly if you or your interlocutor on that podcast said this specifically, but I think it was sort of being communicated was, you know, from a perspective of a Catholic, and this may be something that you overlay on it looking back, since, like you said, your move into kind of being a generalist preceded the whole conversion to Catholicism. But there's something in that's kind of lovely, just about recognizing the gifts you've been given and trying to maximize those, trying to use those in a way that can be a blessing to other people, that can be fruitful, that, you know, sort of a don't bury talents in the ground, but, you know, return them to the Lord with increase in some way. And I guess maybe a question would be, have you found opportunities to engage people who first contact you through your fitness work, with the philosophy, the faith, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So yes to both. You're right. I do have to overlay it, but I think you're exactly right. And thank you for providing me a scriptural justification for my book. I'll happily take that and just say, yep, that's totally right. No disagreement there. And, you know, it helps with priority and balance and stuff like that too. I think if you're kind of a hyper specialist, you can put your identity a little too much in one thing, and maybe suffer from idolatry too. Just something to keep an eye out for, right? To the second point, yeah, you know, it works both ways. A lot of times, and people like don't realize that it's like the same Pat Flynn. You know, sometimes people will be like, they'll find me at the philosophy stuff, or look at the best argument for God, and I'll get an email and be like, wait, I just found this YouTube kettlebell. Like, are you that guy? yeah, that's me, right? Like, how does that make sense? And like, I don't even try to explain it up front, because it usually confuses people, because it's confusing, right? And then, yeah, lots of other people, it goes the other way, because my fitness platforms are, you know, substantially bigger than my philosophy ones. That's just the nature of it, right? So a lot of people come from the fitness side, and somehow or other, and it's not like they even just stumble upon it. Like, if you follow my fitness content, like, you just read my profile, right? You'll get links to my other channels and stuff like that. They'll find that, and then, you know, maybe take a peek. And, you know, I get all sorts of responses there, Steve. You know, some are like, oh, I didn't know you're, you know, so into this. That's amazing. Other times, you know, there might be some irritation, right? As you can imagine, but all opportunities for engagement. So yeah, absolutely. That happens. Yep.
Yeah, that's that is, I hadn't thought about it going the other way, but sure, you know, maybe there are some, formerly flabby philosophers out there who owe their new toned and healthy lifestyle to the kettlebell and fitness end of their favorite philosopher, Pat Flynn. That's pretty great to think about as well.
Yeah, and, you know, I'm grateful for those opportunities. You know, the worlds they're distinct, right? But they're certainly not entirely separate, right? I've got my philosophy podcast, and part of that's like, honestly, part of that is just to please the algorithm. Like YouTube and these places hate if you have mixed content because it doesn't know what audience to target, right? Like it. So, but at the same time, like I hope people do that. I hope people, find my fitness content and then, take a look at the philosophy stuff. And same thing, vice versa. I love when Catholics find or just philosophers find my philosophy content and then they suddenly email me like, "Hey, I just got a set of kettlebells." Thanks. Yeah.
Well,
awesome.
And it speaks to what you were alluding to earlier, with just the beauty of the human person as both a material and a spiritual being, and a union of the two in a single nature. That means, that's the philosophy, of course, is fundamentally important to being an integrated human being, as is the physical end of it. And either one of those is easy to ignore or give short shrift. So the effort to be as strong as possible and as fit as possible on both those fronts, I think that's a profoundly human thing.
And not only that, but I mean, just a short little note that is that, like, one thing that attracted me to Catholicism and the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas is like, we're not hardcore, dualistic Gnostics, right? We are embodied, right? And our body is a good thing. It's not some like, material prison to escape from.
That's right.
Right? It's something to cherish and be grateful for and to protect and to nourish and develop and all those things. So that was, coming from a fitness, being super into fitness for a while, like that was, I'm on board with that. That sounds right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think there's good philosophical arguments for it too, but there was a resonance there. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You were talking about, your experience as an undergrad taking philosophy classes, and most of them were terrible. I taught philosophy and ethics as an adjunct for a local community college here for a number of years. And I would ask students when they first came into the 101 or the 105, I would say, okay, so raise your hand if you're here in this class because you have a deep love for and passion for philosophy. And of course, there'd be the one awesome nerd guy in the back, who just got finished reading Ayn Rand or something.
Yeah, the libertarian.
Yeah. So he's totally, that's why he's here. And then I would, of course, expecting that outcome, I would follow it up by saying, how many of you are here because this is a core humanities class that gets you 3 credits and it fits your schedule? And I'm like, good. That's all. We're all operating honestly here. That's wonderful. Let's have some fun with that. But in talking to students, both in the early stages of a course and then sometimes at the end, so many of them had the impression that philosophy is this useless, tedious exercise in like intellectual gymnastics, but it has just no bearing, no contact with, no relevance for your actual life. It's like, a bunch of super smart nerds sit around trying to decide whether the chair at the front of the room exists or not. Like, I mean, good grief. I need to finish my degree and get a job and pay my bills. And, so this is, again, one of the things that I've appreciated about philosophy for the people and the folks that you talk with there too. You are always all about, philosophy is important. And maybe even more than important, maybe essentially important. And there's nothing more relevant than philosophy. That idea, I think, has just lost traction in our contemporary culture.
Yes.
Make that case a little bit. Why do you feel that is still true, even in a culture where, what do we need philosophy for? I got laptops and smartphones and social media and endless streaming entertainment. Like, why would I waste my time sitting around thinking about stuff?
Yeah, this is great. And like, certainly that was my experience. And if I wasn't already into philosophy, like before my undergrad, it's hard to imagine that I would have been anything but like repulsed by that experience. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like my intro to ethics professor was your literally cartoon version of like the hardcore moral relativist who was just, you had to sign the paper and like agree to a pledge before, like, it was insane. Right?
Wow.
My other professor I had for another intro course was really kind of like a confused course in like comparative religious studies more than it was philosophy. So like in both cases, I'm like, this is like not only probably useless, but actively like it'd be better if people didn't take these courses. Right. Other people can complain because like, oh, I did, this philosophy course, and all we were subjected to were these weird thought experiments about whether the chair is real or if I'm a brain in a vat or something like that, right? Yeah, like that sucks. That's unfortunate. So, I mean, it probably wouldn't hurt to just start by helping to explain to people what philosophy is and why it's important. So, I think in my book, I say, well, what philosophy is really is just taking all those questions that you thought were really great and important as a child and then trying to answer them seriously as an adult. Why does anything exist? What is the difference between right or wrong, good or bad? Is there a difference between right or wrong, or good or bad? Right? What makes something right or wrong, good or bad? Is it wrong to just drop a nuke on a whole bunch of people when a war's like, that's a practical question, right? Should I, like questions of should I do this, should I do that? Those are moral questions, right? And to understand what philosophers are up to, you just need to just think about the types of questions philosophers ask. Now, granted, some of these are going to seem a lot more obscure than others, but I think if you can't tell a story of why it's important, that's a problem, right? So, for example, philosophers might ask really strange and weird questions like, is it okay to marry a chicken? Does it make sense to marry a chicken, right? But those types of questions should get you thinking about things that are really important, like not just what is marriage, but is marriage something that could even have a nature, right? That it could even be a thing in a sense. And if so, what is it? Because that's a practical question. It's a political question. People talk about marriage all the time and they have big disagreements about it. So thinking about weird questions like that can at least angle you into something that I think does have enormous practical significance because it's our culture, right? Then there are questions about possibility and modality, right? Just because I can imagine something or conceive of something, does that mean that it's really possible? Now that's an interesting question because a lot of times we think that we should pursue something because I can imagine that I can accomplish it. But I'm not going to pursue something if I don't at least think it's possible that I can accomplish something. But philosophers think seriously about that, right? Like, is imagination or conceivability, these are different things, a reliable guide to real possibility? So like initially stated, that might just seem like an obscure question, but there's deep practical significance there, right? I'm not going to try to build a business or become a great guitar player or go to outer space just because I can imagine those things. But should I think that imagination is a good guide to possibility? Interesting twist. I actually don't think imagination and conceivability are great guides to possibility, but that shouldn't discourage you from pursuing your dreams. If you want to chase that line of thought later, we can. All right. And then, there's other questions just haunt you in a deep existential sense that like, it's practical because you just, at least for me, you couldn't escape them. Like, why am I here? What is the meaning of life? How am I supposed to live? What am I supposed to do with myself, right? What is this thing that we call love? Is it just, axons firing? Is that all that love is? I mean, to my mind, once you understand philosophy just by thinking about the sorts of questions philosophers ask, I don't know what could be more important, what could be more fundamental than that. These are the questions that shape and orient everything else and give context to our entire lives. And with a context, direct the action of our lives. And here's the thing I always tell people. It's a little cliche, but it's true. It's not like you can escape doing philosophy. You can only escape doing philosophy well. Nobody escapes having commitments. Commitments about value, about purpose, about what constitutes the world. They might be implicit. You might not think about them, but they're guiding you. They're orienting you. So the question is, are you just going to keep doing that, right? And chances are, if you're like most people, you just have a haphazard heap of different commitments. Many of them are probably deeply in conflict with with others, right? It's just a mess, right? So the philosopher is somebody who tries to pull out those commitments, make them explicit, take a critical look at them, discard the ones that they don't think are any good, replace them with better ones, and then try to get the whole thing to hang together. Coherence, right? So there's no, internal contradiction or serious tensions. So you have a bunch of commitments that you hope are true, that work together, and that give context and meaning and orientation to your life. That sounds important to me. It always sounded important to me. I think it is, and I think that's perhaps a better way to, if I were doing a 101 course, I'd at least try to start with something like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love that. There's a G.K. Chesterton quote, which I would butcher if I tried to do it exactly, but he essentially echoes what you just said, and that is, you can't not have a philosophy. Every person has a philosophy. It's a question of whether you've consciously subscribed to a system of thought whole and entire and embraced its implications, or whether you're just sort of working on a series of slogans and bumper stickers that you got from different thinkers and different worldviews and different thought systems and have cobbled together in spite of the contradictions and incoherence and incompatibilities. One of the things that I tried to do, I guess former students would have to weigh in as to whether I was at all successful or not, but having recognized the fact that, you know, most people, I think, operate by default with sort of this grab bag of ideas, most of which they don't understand fully, even at face value, none of which they could trace the provenance of. You know, where does this idea come from? Whose thought is this that I'm quoting here? Most of them have no idea. And then, of course, the question of whether it's all coherent and hangs together is something that I think is largely unreflective in most folks that I've encountered. That being said, one of the things I would attempt to do is try to help students. I called it meet your teachers. So I would try to kind of get from them, you know, what are some of the core tenets of your philosophy? You know, put your in air quotes there, because of course it's not really theirs, but you know, and they'd have certain phrases or ideas, and then I'd say, well, it would be helpful to take that little phrase or that little idea or that little slogan and put it back into the context of the philosophy from which it was taken. And then you get to meet the thinker who said that or wrote that or held that or proposed that. And you get to see it in the context of that thinker's larger philosophy. And then you can kind of get it on its feet, you know, get it walking, see where it takes you, and then decide. If you like where it goes, then yeah. But you might be surprised that some of these ideas that sound so good when they're taken out of context and just cut down to bumper sticker size, actually are kind of frightening when they're back in their proper context and you see where that whole system of thought goes. So that's a rambling
that's great,
way
Steve.
to sidle up to a question, and that is, as you and I both know, ideas have consequences.
I was going to say it. Yep, absolutely.
We look at our culture, and there are ideas chopping wood and produced all over the place. What are, in your view, having had a lot of these conversations, some of the ideas that drive our culture at the moment, and who are some of the philosophers then that, by virtue of their ideas, are kind of driving the culture? I guess for good or ill, you can take that where you want it to, but just sort of like that meet your teachers paradigm a little bit.
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, this is a fascinating question. I think our culture at large isn't driven by any coherent system of ideas. I think it's, you know, cobbled like most individual people are, right? I mean, you see strains of mechanism and utilitarianism, but you also still do see strains of like virtue ethic in there. And I'll give you an example. I went and saw that Fantastic Four movie. It was pretty good. It was pretty good recently. And, you know, it struck me because, man, I don't want to give like spoilers. I don't think this is a major spoiler. So hit pause for the next like minute if like you don't want to hear anything about this movie. But like one of the main plot points is that the villain will spare planet Earth if the fantastic couple, you know, gives their baby over to the villain, right? And they staunchly refuse, right? And then, of course, there's like a bunch of protesters who are clearly like influenced by utilitarianism, like, no, like the calculus makes sense, right? Trade the baby, you selfish, you know, fools or whatever. I thought that was interesting because like clearly here's like an anti-utilitarian message, which I think is correct.
Yeah.
But like almost certainly it was probably written by people who are themselves utilitarians, right? At the end of the day in Hollywood, right? So like it's interesting, but like here's your intuition test against utilitarianism. Like, who were you rooting for in that movie, right? Was it the people saying fork over the bill? Or, you know, everybody knows, right, that the right decision was to not hand over the baby, to protect your baby, and then do what you could to thwart the villain, right? Not to just run some sort of moral math, right? Or something like that, right? Utilitarianism is a big one, right? Guiding our culture, guiding so many poor political decisions. Reductionism, mechanism, I mean, you see this particularly and heated debates, life debates, abortion, stuff like that. The nature of personhood, right? And again, it's because our culture has so many different philosophical positions that you see so many different clashes. If everyone was of the same position, there wouldn't be these debates. But it's not. It's important to understand that, like, again, most people are unaware of it. But how you answer those types of questions, right, shows presumably the type of deeper philosophical positions you hold. I say presumably because people are often inconsistent. They'll adopt whatever position they need just to get the conclusion they want, of course, right?
Right. And Pat, for viewers who might be light on the lingo, can you maybe give just sort of an easy 101 definition of some of the reductionism, mechanism, utilitarianism, what those mean?
Yeah. So these are a lot of modern philosophies. A mechanism is a sort of causally impoverished worldview that tries to explain everything, we might say, etiologically, and that is with respect to how one physical event relates to another physical event. So think that everything is kind of like a pushing cause, right? Something like that. It's very different than what I think the correct worldview is, that has a very pluralistic understanding of causality and explanation, that causes come in many different forms. I mean, you can even think back to classic Aristotle, who has his four causes. He does have efficient productive causes, but he also has formal causes, what gives shape or configuration to things. He has final causes, which he calls the cause of all causes, that for the sake of which something is brought into operation or acts a certain way. And of course, he has his material cause, which is a sort of constitutional cause, right? With that which is configured in a certain way. I think that's the right way to look at the world. But if you have a sort of more holistic, broadly Aristotelian type of understanding, you're probably not going to be a reductionist. So you don't think that a human person is nothing over and above particles, say, something like that, right? You actually think that we have a substantial form that gives configuration to all of our physical parts, and that substantial form is actually more fundamental than the physical bits, if you will, right? They give direction to not just the particles, but even ourselves. And clearly, right, we have all this incredible organized, coordinated activity of the parts that is in relation to the whole. There's a real priority to the whole. And this is in our world, but this is most obviously true when it comes to living organisms. So this would be an anti-reductionist view. You can't explain everything about the whole by way of the microphysical base. And I think that that's absolutely true, right? So those would be, in a quick, brief sketch of two different positions that are at odds, with an opinionated version of it, anyways. Right? See where I stand. But right, so these are things that have significant debate. So for me, you are what you are because you have a human nature, and you had that human nature right when you were conceived. Right? You had obviously you were not as developed. Many of your potencies were not yet actualized, but you were not potentially a human. You are actually human with various potencies that have yet to be actualized. Whereas if you reject that system and you're some sort of reductionist and you're trying to find a basis for what humanity or a lot of it comes down to personhood is, it's really tough, right? Because it starts to become really arbitrary. They tend to try and base it in some level of complexity, usually related to cognitional activity or consciousness or something like that. But the problem with that is, again, it's very arbitrary, and where you draw these lines seems to have really unfortunate consequences of declaring some people who obviously are people not people, right, or less valuable than other people who have higher degrees of these types of things. So I think that there's, apart from just general life issues, I think there's serious negative ethical implications to that. Whereas if you have what I call what is called an essentialist worldview, this Aristotelian paradigm, where things have real essences or natures, right? You're grounding the real kind of sameness and ontological status of us in our nature, right? Which we all share, right? Every one of us, despite our disparities in intellectual abilities or level of development, age, or any of that. And I would say that's actually a really nice result, because now, because of that real sameness, we have a basis of for justice, right, across all of humanity that isn't just unevenly proportioned according to level of development, size, age, abilities, and I think that's a result we should want, right? But then to be consistent with that, I think that you need to think very seriously about these end of life and abortion issues, right? And I don't think the costs of, if you already have like conclusions on either end, are worth absorbing for abandoning the type of view that has, like you said, Steve, those implications. You got to think about implications in philosophy all the time. That's what philosophers do well when they're at their best, is they're system builders, systematic thinkers. How does my commitment over here influence my commitment over here? Like, how does my thinking about philosophical anthropology, the nature of the human person, affect my commitments to end-of-life issues or beginning-of-life issues? Like, these are things that have connections, even if you aren't always totally aware of them.
Yeah, that seamless garment effect of the Catholic intellectual tradition, for me, was that was the most compelling piece intellectually about being Catholic. Just the overlapping and mutually illuminative coherence of all the different. I mean, you press the Catholic intellectual tradition on one issue, and you find it's connected to every other issue, and it's connected in a coherent way. It's not like, well, this makes sense over here so long as we don't think about this other topic over here. If we think about that, then things just start to throw belts and leak oil. And then by contrast, my experience, and I would say this has been pretty consistent down through the years. My experience of other philosophies, other worldviews, other intellectual traditions, especially coming up out of kind of like the modern world, the increasingly secular West that we all live in, is it just doesn't have anything comparable to offer in terms of breadth and depth and consistency and coherence. And I love the way you teed it up kind of at the beginning of our conversation. We said it's a beautiful story.
Yeah,
we're asking what is the story of reality? What's the true story about the world we live in, the lives we live, the universe we experience and observe? And it turns out it's a beautiful story. It's a compelling story. It's a comforting story. And I wonder sometimes if there's not a strain in the modern world and the secular culture where there's almost a suspicion of a beautiful story, because it has to be dark. It has to be shallow and narrow and frightening and filled with existential angst.
Yeah.
If there's like comfort in it, if there's consolation, those are psychological fairy tales.
Yeah, it's a crutch. Yeah, a crutch to help you, move through life. All right, so I'm going to say a few things. First, to your point about the logical system of the Catholic, dogma and doctrine. Absolutely, that impressed me. I mean, what really impressed me, going back to as I was being exposed to it, was like it was very clear that there was a logical system here. Like, even if you don't think any of it's true, it's clear that those who are working to understand the implications within the Catholic paradigm are hugely concerned about consistency and how what you say in Christology determines what you should say or need to say in Mariology and vice versa. Like, it's like these things are very, very well thought through and really impressive. So that I just want to note that absolutely struck me as well. Like, they're not arbitrary, right? Even though it might seem like it on the face of it. Just because you just haven't seen the connections doesn't mean the connections aren't there. They are, right? And there's centuries of building them out. To your other question, which now escaped my mind, was, remind me, Steve.
I guess the question of whether there's sort of an inherent suspicion.
Oh, of hope. Yeah, good.
And modern secular of something beautiful or consoling. Like there's such an embrace of cynicism and darkness and existential angst kind of.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? So, I mean, there's the typical cliche, you just believe in God because it gives you aid and comfort. Well, look, man, that sword cuts both ways. I can tell you that there's a lot about the idea of a sort of nihilistic universe that can provide aid and comfort, specifically if there's a sort of weight of conscience or guilt that you want to kind of shoo away, right? So if we're going to do armchair psychoanalysis, we'll go back and forth all day long. I don't think it's productive. What's productive is what's true. What do we have good reasons to think is true? And off the bat, I don't have any good reasons to think that the best story is any less plausible than something that's not the best story, right? And in fact, when I think you think it through and you realize that actually the only sort of fundamental theory that I think can give an extremely robust explanatory account of everything is something where that fundamental entity is absolutely perfect and unrestricted along being, power, goodness, and knowledge, right? That actually seems to me, by the light of reason, the only thing that could ground everything else. So like off the bat, just from that, like that's going to anticipate, I think, a much better story than a much worse or nihilistic one. And of course, there's contours, and as Christians, I love how Elizabeth Anscombe described Christianity as a severe practical religion. It's a severe, like it's serious, right? It's not all rainbows and unicorns. Something happened, something really bad, right? But God is working to redeem and restore, right? So, like sin is real. Christianity is a severe practical religion. It's not just flowers and groovy and all that, right? I mean, there's all that. So it's the drama of salvation for sure. So yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say about like the charge of wishful thinking, because I think it ignores rather than deals with the more serious intellectual matter, which is there any good reason for actually thinking that this or that is true, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then walk us into a little bit, because here's another thing that you've spent a lot of time on. The problem of evil, as you said earlier, Aquinas basically says that the two possible arguments against God's existence are the problem of evil and the possibility that nature can just sort of explain itself somehow. Interesting is you said the two of those kind of converged in your own experience to push you off the ranch of Christianity and into sort of a naturalist, an atheist position. But I think that just continues to be true. Those at the heart of the matter, those two continue to be the most compelling arguments for most people. Certainly on the faith versus reason, dichotomy, which is pushed a lot in our culture. That leans into that. Hey, listen, nature can explain itself. We don't have all the answers as to how yet, but stick around, wait for it. Science has done a lot of pretty incredible stuff no one would have ever thought possible. It'll eventually decode all of reality in scientific terms, and then we'll be fine. But that problem of evil one, especially in the face of the fact that, what we do as Catholics, I think if we understand our own story, we do say it's a beautiful story. It's a story of a personal God who loves us, who wills and intends that we exist, who wants us to be with him, who took matters into his own hands when we had lost the union that we were made for, all that stuff. And then someone will, I think, in a sense, understandably, will respond to that view almost with a, well, yeah, okay, but what about evil? Like you're ignoring, boy, you sure are big on this God, but this is the same God then, since there's only one of them, who, lets kids die of cancer and, genocide, et cetera. Walk us into that problem a little bit and kind of the answers that you see as maybe being helpful in dealing with that. Because I think that one still haunts the conversation quite a bit.
And it's a serious matter. It's one I've always taken seriously. And I think if you're willing to take it seriously, it can actually be a very fruitful intellectually and spiritually thing to contemplate, and not just intellectually. I mean, we all suffer and have had great suffering in our lives, and know people who have suffered greatly. So again, there's huge practical significance to these types of things. Depending how you answer these questions will perhaps largely determine how you respond to suffering in your own life and in the lives of others. So this is another area of not just philosophy, but theology that has enormous practical significance. So let me go through a couple different ways of thinking about this. It's sometimes helpful you see this in the literature, to differentiate between what's called a defense and a theodicy when it comes to the problem of evil. I've got technical papers on both of these, actually. And depending, you say what's going to be helpful for people, it kind of depends where you are currently, right? So think about it like this. Okay, think that you already have lots of good reasons to think that God exists. Maybe you've got lots of different arguments and you think, oh yeah, God really would be the best explanation for contingency and consciousness and rationality. Like God just explains so much, and then there's just this problem of evil that just seems totally, in contradiction to the idea of an all-powerful, all-loving, all-good God. All right, so then what might be helpful to that person is just simply a defense, which is just to show that there's no contradiction, right? So a defense just shows that they're not incompatible, whereas a theodicy goes further. A theodicy tries to show you why God actually allows, in this world, the suffering and evil that he does. You see the difference, right? So a defense is like, here's just a possible scenario to show that these things aren't compatible. Not even saying that this scenario is actual, but just showing there's no contradiction here, right? So that way, if you think that evil was just, such a major issue, that it's strictly compatible with God, that it overweight everything else, if we can show you it's not totally incompatible, then, the weight of reasons in favor of God can take over for you from there. And maybe you just leave it a mystery at that point. Like, I've got great reasons to believe in God and to think that God is all good, all powerful. I have no reason to think that evil contradicts that. I don't know why God allows it, but maybe I don't need to know why. I just need to live a religious life, and maybe all will be answered in the eschaton or something like that. There's a lot of people like that. That's all they need, right? So here there's a couple different approaches for theodicies. The issue generally is that when people point out certain instances of evil, especially what are called horrendous evils in the literature, like childhood cancer and stuff like that, they'll say, "Well, I don't see any reason that could justify this, that could morally justify allowing this to happen." And there's a whole contingent of philosophers out there who have developed responses in a school known as skeptical theism. And what they're doing is they're essentially showing that the leap from saying I don't see a reason to there is no reason, or even there is probably no reason, is completely unjustified, right? And I think that's correct. I think that is correct to say that sort of inference, which is what you need to run a problem of evil, either a logical one or an evidential one, is totally unjustified. Why? There's lots of reasons. One is because, we're just not in an epistemic position to assess the appropriate conceptual landscape of values and goods that God is in a position to assess, right? So, kind of a crude example is I'm a neophyte at chess. I really don't know much about chess at all. If I'm playing against a chess master, I might not see any reason for any particular move that the chess master makes. But am I justified in saying that there is no reason or probably no reason? Of course not, right? Because I'm not in a good epistemic position to make that sort of judgment. Now, whatever the distance is between me and the chess master is obviously like infinitely eclipsed between whatever the distance is between me and God and the sort of potential conceptual range of moral values and goods that God could bring about by allowing the world that he does. And importantly, from this perspective, like, I don't even have to give you a list of what those might be, because all we have to do is just show that sort of inference that's running this problem of evil is not a good one. And I think examples like that are very handy for that, right? Importantly, I'm not saying that's a good answer to why God allows evil. I'm saying that sort of project is a good answer to show why problems of evil don't succeed, right? As presented by atheists, right? Because they're relying on a certain inference that I think can be easily challenged, right? Again, is that going to be helpful for people? It depends where you are, right? If you already think you have good reasons to believe in God, and you just need like some reason to think that everything the atheist saying, don't succeed in taking down the case for God, that could be perfectly sufficient for people. And then you go, live a spiritual life of prayer and all that, and just, have a justified belief that God does have his reasons, his good reasons. You don't have access to them at this point, but you can believe that they're good reasons because God has them, right? So that's one project. Okay, another way to go about it is to tell some sort of actual theodicy, right? And boy, there's a lot here. Before I get to that, the other way to go about it is this. All right, so when we're looking at certain data of reality, let's take suffering, that there is suffering in the world. Nobody denies that. Nobody should do it. Don't even focus on evil, because evil requires a moral assessment or a moral judgment. Something shouldn't be. I don't even want to do that, because that already is kind of conceptually loaded, I would argue, towards a theistic worldview, right? Because you'll sometimes say, well, you can't even affirm evil without the existence of God, so blah, blah. I don't like that move. I want to steelman the opposition and say, let's just focus on suffering, right? There's suffering in the world, right? And we don't like it. That's that. I don't think anybody would deny that. Okay. All right. So you might initially think, well, the amounts and the types and distribution of suffering just seems like not at all the kind of world that God would create. Okay, maybe that's true. Maybe there's a low probability that God would create a world with this much suffering and these types of suffering, right? But that itself doesn't really tell you much, right? Because what you need to ask is compared to what? What other paradigm can also give a story about suffering and evil that has a much higher, likelihood of a world like this? And this is the part of the conversation that people miss, and I've got a paper coming out in an edited volume that develops this argument in more detail, and I do say something about this in my book as well. And if we're at least comparing classical theism to what I think is the most plausible form of naturalism, people, we're going to get a little bit technical here, but I just indulge me for a moment. People just assume, well, on naturalism, the suffering makes perfect sense. Why? Because Darwinism, survival of the fittest, evolutionary forces, nature is red in tooth and claw. So like the fact that the world is replete with suffering and all the travesties that we have, and it's an unguided, ruthless process. There's no God. It's exactly what we would expect. And since that's exactly what we would expect on naturalism, that is evidential weight for naturalism, since we wouldn't have that expectation on theism. That's the argument, right?
Right.
Now, I'll say, even if you granted all that, you might say, okay, that's evidential weight for naturalism, but there's all this other evidential weight for theism: consciousness, contingency, morality, right? So like the scale, you could even just grant all that and just still make the case that the rational scales just tip decisively in favor of theism thing. But I don't want to concede it, right? Because what I want to say is, okay, it's a very superficial analysis, and a more substantial analysis yields a different result, because naturalism isn't just Darwinism. Naturalism in its most plausible forms is reductionism, a sort of physicalism. Now here's the kind of technical point. I'll try to get it across a little bit as simply as possible. I think when it comes to qualitative experiences, the what it is likeness to taste chocolate or to be in pain, the problem here is that naturalism doesn't have a good story for why these things are actually there. Why? Because they typically identify them with physical events or processes, and they're what philosophers call sort of epiphenomenal residue, right? So, your desire to eat chocolate doesn't actually cause you to go eat chocolate. What causes you to eat chocolate are all the mechanical, physical processes underneath that somehow coincidentally, flew off this qualitative desiring to have chocolate, right? And the reason this is a problem, first off, the reason so many naturalists and physicalists are epiphenomenalists is because of the deeper inner logic of naturalism, right? That we're supposed to explain everything through this sort of, atomic theory, where whatever is happening at the higher levels or the macro levels is determined by what's going on at the micro levels underneath, right? So that applies to all of your mental states and intentional attitudes and all this or that. The problem is that the qualitative experiences don't have any, we would say, downward causal effect. They just float atop this completely deterministic stream of physical causes, and have no influence on what those physical causes are. The physical events totally determine the qualitative events, but the qualitative happenings have no influence on the physical events. Are you with me so far? Right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Why does this matter? Well, it matters because it totally disrupts the story that the naturalists wanted to tell about suffering. The story that naturalists want to tell about suffering is, oh, well, we have pain and all this stuff because it helps us to avoid certain threats or dangers. No, it doesn't. The feeling of pain has nothing to do with it. It's all those unfeeling physical events, right? The feeling of pain, the what it is likeness to be in pain and to suffer has no causal relevance whatsoever on this paradigm at all. It's useless. So one wonders, why is it even there? This is like a serious problem in philosophy of mind for naturalists and physicalists. Why are there any qualitative states at all? Particularly since, if epiphenomenalism is true, and disclaimer, not all naturalists are epiphenomenalists, but I think it is really hard to avoid epiphenomenalism if you're a naturalist without becoming extremely contrived. So I understand, before somebody comments that, right? I understand that that's it, but it's really hard to avoid it given these commitments. So if that's the case, you don't really have an explanation for why there's any qualitative experiences there at all, or why they seem to be kind of harmonious or relevant to the actions that happen in relation to them. Right? This is a phenomena sometimes called as psychophysical harmony. It's a big issue right now. Like, why do these states tend to correlate with situations where, like, it makes sense to, like, be in pain if you're being damaged, but if there's no causal relevance to that what it is likeness, then why is there any what it is likeness at all, and why is it that particular what it is likeness, supervening or whatever on that state, right?
Right. Why do you not have the qualitative experience of eating a delicious chocolate bar when someone hammers your foot with a crowbar?
Because if the underlying physical events are what are doing all the work, it doesn't matter. You could have the experience of eating chocolate, and as long as your joints are in the right place, you'll survive. So it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. All right, now this is a technical. I get it's a technical point. We're skipping a lot of details, but what I'm saying is when you really look under the hood and you look at this, what you realize is that suffering is a qualitative experience. And if everything that we just said is right, then the naturalist has no explanation for it. It's just there. And it just correlates. But that Darwin story is irrelevant to that, right? Because evolution is downstream of this physicalist account. It's what it selects for would be relevant to the physical processes, not to what it is likeness, because that is causally irrelevant, right? So you can't just like bring back in Darwin to solve this issue. And if that's right, that means that the naturalist doesn't have any story whatsoever to tell about why we have these experiences of suffering, which is what is generally focused on for the problem of evil, intense, periods of suffering. All right? Okay. All right. So now you said, all right, maybe theism doesn't have a very good story. But guess what? A very good story is better than no story.
Right.
And I think theism actually does have a good story. But I'm just saying, just for the sake of argument, you can say, okay, maybe it's not a very good story. Maybe you think it's only like 5% likely that God would create a world with this much evil and suffering. Okay, but that's better than no story at all. Right? So in a relevant comparison, this would be evidential weight for theism. Okay. Now there's a lot of objections and questions, including that that theism and naturalism on a perfect partition. There's other worldviews, but that I think is actually a really helpful way to think about it. But it involves, again, systems thinking and understanding that like you need to like think about how naturalists think about causation and philosophy of mind and qualitative experiences and all this or that to see the relevance to the problem of
Back
evil,
to
and that's
to the worldview,
and that's what I try to draw out in that paper. Then the final point, I think the most robust one, and we don't have to get into it too much now because it's always a subject that I think deserves an extended treatment, just because it's a sensitive subject, and rightfully so. You don't want to be like rushy with it or anything, right? That there is a very plausible, I think, good story that you can tell. That's deeply embedded within the Christian tradition of why God would allow the types and amount of suffering that he does. And I'll just give two philosophers. If people want to go deeper into this. One is, again, a brilliant Thomist. If anybody wants a book giving a very beautiful theodicy that's hopeful and metaphysically and philosophically rich, Eleanor Stump, wonderful philosopher, her book Wandering in Darkness. It's only about 800 pages, so you should be able to easy weekend read it. But honestly, if it's really great, and even you could even just skip to the biblical narrative section of that book and just read that, and it'd be great. And then the other one is a little bit more just kind of technical and to the point. It would be by Peter von Inwagen, and he's got a book called The Problem of Evil, where he treats it, I think, really rather decisively, and he focuses on the problem of divine hiddenness too, which is kind of, I think it's under the umbrella of the problem of evil. Some people kind of disagree with that, but no, I think that's right. And then I'll even plug my book too a little bit, because I do trot out theodicy that is inspired by both of them. So if you kind of want a more summary version of what both of those thinkers think, you don't want the full 800-page version, you could look at my book, The Best Argument for God, because I'm drawing significantly from both of those two thinkers in there.
Yeah, excellent. And so I want to respect your time and the fact that you have other things going on in life, but I do want to just maybe to close with this particular question. There's a million other. We'll have to reconvene this little party of two and continue some of these discussions down the road. But in terms of just in your view, as someone who thinks a lot about, has studied, is studying philosophy, and who is also a committed Catholic, it may be a little bit of a nuance on a question that we took up earlier. You know, people look at philosophy and contemporary culture and say, well, what's the point? What's the relevance? What does it have to offer modern man? Maybe under kind of a philosophical heading. The same question about the Catholic faith. Here again, another institution which for many people in our culture, and you see this, of course, statistically reflected in the rise of the NONES nuns, right?
Yeah.
You know, people are just disaffiliating from religion. A lot of them say, I just don't really see the point. I don't really see that it's relevant. It's kind of been discredited, disproven. It doesn't have much to say to modern man. It doesn't push back on that a little bit, you know, maybe employing some philosophy. But what in your view, does Catholicism have to offer our contemporary culture? What does Catholicism, maybe its intellectual tradition, have to offer modern man?
Well, here's a statement that's going to probably offend modern sensibilities, but I'll say it anyways. It offers authority. And authority is not a bad thing, you know. And I say this as a former recovering libertarian, right? Who hated the idea of authority. But here's some truth that I think when you think about the nature of the human person is we're not just rational animals, we're rational social animals that are deeply dependent upon authority and tradition. I mean, so much of what we know and how we get around in the world crucially requires various different authorities, particularly epistemic authorities. These would be authorities that help us with respect to belief formation, right? Because we think that they're credible and that if we follow epistemic authorities, we'll be more likely to form true beliefs or at least avoid false ones or something like that. All right, so why is that relevant to Catholicism? Well, Catholicism makes some pretty radical claims, right? It claims that it is the church founded by our Lord Jesus Christ, you know, on the first pope, Peter, and it is endowed with infallibility, which is an extension of indefectibility. Now, you have to qualify that heavily because it's hugely misunderstood. It doesn't mean that the pope's going to be able to predict with 100% accuracy, you know, whether the Brewers are going to win their next baseball game or something like that. The way to think about infallibility, I think, is this, right? God reveals stuff to us, you know, namely revelation, propositional revelation. But it's often clothed in a certain context and culture. Those contexts and cultures change, and as they change and evolve, the need for preservation and interpretation becomes very significant, right? Very, very significant. And this is true for me, Steve, when I started thinking about, okay, you know, Christianity in general and sort of the logic of Christianity. That, you know, this thing of infallibility, it might seem a little silly at first, but somebody who's really brilliant on this and converted to Catholicism was John Henry Newman. And the way he saw it was this, is that if you don't have some sort of mechanism in play, right? If you just say that there's a church and maybe it's generally reliable, then what's going to happen is because we're fallible humans, errors are going to creep in concerning, you know, the proper, you know, interpretation or transmission of revelation, including what counts as revelation. You know, there's the whole issue of what is even the canon to begin with, which is major, right? But over time, those errors are going to be compounded. They're going to multiply exponentially. And then what was generally reliable is not going to be reliable at all. So if these things really are important, right, and this is to your point, Steve, right, that we believe that God revealed these things to us because they are essential, right? They're essential for us, for our salvation and for our flourishing. If they're really important, then it stands to reason that God is going to put some mechanism in place that at least guarantees the whole thing isn't going to go completely off the rails, right? Like minimally that, right? And that's the doctrine of infallibility, right? That the church is divinely protected. It's not because the Pope's a cool guy, but it's God protecting his church to avoid putting any one person in the impossible position of having to choose between schism or heresy. That's it. That's why it's there. It's a gift to the church, not for the Pope or the cardinals or anybody else. It's a gift for the church because with respect to the essential matters of faith and morals, that's what infallibility, you know, that's what it wraps around, right? It's because these are essential that God isn't going to let it go completely off the rails. That says nothing about the moral character of people in the church. We know that there's always been scoundrels. God help us, there always will be, right? It's the logic of revelation, I would say, that if you think that there is true revelation, which again I think there's philosophical reason to expect something like that, right? That this is not only the system or the structure that I think is really the only sort of tenable one, and that fits with our nature as social beings that live in community, rely on tradition, and need authority, right? That is befitting of the human, and we're physical beings, sacraments and all that. Like Catholicism is deeply fitting of human nature, right? If you think that that's right, and God's going to reveal something, for me, just to be perfectly frank, it was Catholicism or bust, right? I don't think, many Protestant, friends, and I respect a lot of Protestant scholars. The issues concerning the boundaries of revelation, the boundaries of canon, the interpretation apart from not just any authority, but an authority that is infallible when it makes, particular formal statements about, dogma and doctrine, just does not seem at all tenable to me, and seems deeply discordant with human nature in particular. So I'll say, as a former recovering libertarian, this is something I had to change my mind on, and of course I did, and I realized, you can't get around having authorities in life, right? Just like you can't get around having a philosophy. The question is just to reflect on what authorities are reliable, right? That's just a good question for general life, right? Right. What authorities are reliable, and whether authority, particularly epistemic authority and teaching authority, makes sense with respect to with revelation, and whether revelation actually is something that you think makes sense given not just the existence of God, but the status of the world, I think, as something that is in need of great help. I think the answer to all of that is yes. And I would think when you think those matters through, in conjunction, final point, with the actual historical credibility of Catholicism, which is not my specialty, we don't even touch, but when you look at just, the history, right, it's very clear what we have is apostolic lineage, right? Wasn't our Lord ascended and down came a closed canon of Scripture. That's not how it worked at all, right? That's just not historical Christianity. So between those philosophical considerations and an extremely credible historical case, that's what brought me in. That's what brought me to the church, Steve. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's such an interesting answer, Pat. I love that you said authority. There's, of course, a million things, we could riff on about what the church offers modern man. But
can I say one more thing real quick, Steve? Because sometimes people will push back. I've heard this push. I have an article, a popular level article on Catholic Answers about this, because sometimes people will push back. So, well, what does the infallibility matter, right? You still need to use your fallible judgment to, pick out the true church. So why can't I use my infallible judgment to discern Scripture, right? And here, again, is where I think it helps to have some good philosophy reflect on human nature. Our nature is such, right, that we can easily detect when something is beyond our pay grade and we need an epistemic authority, and we can reasonably detect what a good epistemic authority might be. We do this all the time. From medicine to hiring a trail guide, right? Yep. So there's many cases where it is very reasonable and responsible to detect an epistemic authority as needed, and even very reasonable and responsible to, take advantage of an epistemic authority. But it would be totally unreasonable to try to replace that epistemic authority and go at it on your own. And once you understand that, you have the principal difference now with respect to religion. Clearly, so much of the nature of revelation and even Scripture and all the historical questions are far beyond the pay grade of even the most highly credentialed specialist, let alone the average person, right? So it's clearly an instance where it's very easy and reasonable to realize, okay, this is an instance where I think an epistemic authority would be a huge help, if not absolutely required. And then, like, it's not hard to discern, what the best epistemic authority would be. I mean, just historically, there's really only one historical extant church that claims to even have that authority anyways, right? It's not like there's, like, 10 options out there all claiming infallibility with a historical, credible historical line. That's not the case. And I think there's a providential reason why that's not the case. So just wanted to put that note in there. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that too. The church is an infallible tour guide for navigating successfully a human life, and yeah, like you say, you turn to any other human being, even experts in whatever they're experts in, and we all have that same question: like, what is life about? What does it mean? What ought I to do? And that's beautiful. So Pat, as we wrap up here, first of all, thank you so much. This has been absolutely delightful. I'd love to do it again at some point if you're up for that.
Absolutely, it has been a delight, Steve. Thank you.
I want to make sure that folks know where they can find you, and I'll stick all your particulars down in the show notes too. But maybe just if someone's interested in chasing down the philosophy stuff, the YouTube channel, the fitness stuff, where can they find more Pat Flynn?
Yeah, thanks. For the philosophy stuff, the most relevant would be my Substack. That's where I'm most active these days. So that is again, humble name, the Journal of Absolute Truth. So if you just look up the Journal of Absolute Truth on Substack, you'll find me over there. And then the companion to that you mentioned is my Philosophy for the People podcast. Lots of conversations and interviews there. For the fitness stuff, I had a new fitness book come out just last year. It's called Strong On. So if you search Strong On by Pat Flynn, you'll find that. It's an introduction to kettlebells. So if you're looking just for like a basic, good, minimalist, generalist fitness plan, you can check that out. And then my fitness website is chroniclesofstrength.com. So those would be the main places.
I love it. Awesome. Thanks so much, brother. We'll look forward to catching up with you down the road.
Thank you, Steve.